welcome into the Cubs Weekly Podcast presented by Wintrust, proud legacy partner of the Chicago Cubs and exclusive home of Cubs checking. Open online today at wintrust.com/Cubs Weekly. Tony Andracki here, joined by these handsome men on my left, Andy Martínez, Lance Brozdowski. We're going to be talking all things Cubs prospects. Lance's prospect rankings are out very, very soon. By the time you're listening to this podcast, they will be live on MarqueeSportsNetwork.com. They also were out, Lance, on your Road to Wrigley show, the week of opening day. You chatted with Jim Callis. But also you're up to top 30 now, so not top 25. So we got more prospect content than we ever had before.
And we used to be top 20, so this is truly an evolution of the list.
So next one, by this time next year, it'll be top 50, top 60?
No.
All right.
One day you're just going to rank every single player because of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. From 1 to 199 or whatever it is. All right, so Lance, now that we have you here, we got to ask a hard-hitting question to lead it off. What Cubs prospect has the best name?
Oh, that's a good one. I think it's the ones that come to mind off the top 30 list are Ballesteros, Moises Ballesteros.
That's a good
really
one.
Fun name.
Name.
It's a good catcher name too. Specifically, you can stick around the plate. And I also kind of like Porter Hodge.
Yep, we said that.
That's the one that sounds just like it's tight. It's like a one-syllable last name that like punches, and he's got great flow too in the hair. So I'm gonna go Porter Hodge and Ballesteros. I think those are two good ones.
Yeah, no, that's great. I remember we were talking also with Kyle Mlanovich, our social coordinator. We were talking Rock Shoulders. I remember when he was at Kane County Cougars, like he was literally a part of the minor league name. There was like a bracket, and he advanced to like the Final Four maybe, or
so
like
good.
Elite Eight. That was fantastic.
Sky Bolt was another good one.
Sky Bolt's a great, especially because he was really fast.
Yeah.
If he wasn't fast, that'd be very.
Yeah, if he was like a power-hitting
good
outfielder or something, not a great name.
But those names like stick out to you too, like you said, like Porter Hodge. He strikes me very much.
Sounds like a pitcher. Yeah.
He sounds like a guy that plays a baseball player in a movie. It's like a character's name,
yes.
like Billy Chappell or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like that sounds like a pitcher's name. Like Porter Hodge just sounds like a baseball player in a movie to me.
Spot on.
All right, so serious questions now.
Okay.
We may have other fun ones if we think of them in the meantime. But Lance, as you put together these top 30 rankings, like what stood out to you most putting these all together? Like, and how did this list maybe differ than past iterations of the list?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to what we were talking about right off the top of this, where we pushed from 25 to 30 prospects now, and it was a little bit difficult to rank, I'd say, between like 3 and 12 and like 13 to 29. Like, there's a lot of overlap between those guys. This is something we emphasized on the show with Jim Callis, our minor league season preview show, where, we were talking about differences between our ranks. Say, I have Owen Casey, I believe, 6th, and Callis had him 13th. And that might look like a large difference, a 7-spot difference, where you're like, one guy's inside the top 10, one's outside. But we didn't really think that there was that large of an actual difference. So there's a lot of consolidation of prospects between 3 and, again, like that 13, 12 window, whatever you want to say in there. And then the whole second half of that list, I rank them in my confidence of those guys jumping up, obviously. Like, I do think every guy in front of the guy behind him is better than that player. But there's really marginal differences between a lot of them, especially as you go deeper into the list. And that's partially why we went to 30, because those extra 5, I think, are relevant and you have to talk about them. And if you leave them off, I think it becomes, you're looking at it, you're like, where's, Kevin Made, or like Luis Devers won minor league pitcher of the year, how is he not on the list?
Yeah.
Like, you kind of have to put those guys in, and it's a testament to the depth I think they've built up in this organization.
So did you notice any differences from the past in terms of how you put it together and how you view the system, whether it was last year's rankings or the year before compared to this year, and how kind of the finished product came to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my list is very heavily reliant on data. For the most part, I get minor league batted ball data and pitch data from the minor league levels, and that is I'd say the differentiator if you're reading my list versus some of the others. I don't know if any other sites do. I think Fangraphs might, but I'm pretty confident the Baseball America pipeline don't. So they're basing it off a lot more scouting, and I think that's a key, is to blend both of them, right, to have different perspectives. And I'm very heavily batted ball based, and I don't know if there's anything that really jumps out, but I think the main thing is thinking about the organization as a whole, especially offensively, seeing the year-over-year growth from 21 to 22 on a particular stat known as xWOBA, which is very nerdy, but essentially you're trying to value offensive performance with things like launch angle, exit velocity, that are a little more predictive. So if you're just looking at a pure batting average statistic, that's going to have a lot of noise year to year. So could be 241 year, could be 280 down to 220. You might have very different perceptions of the player, but along the whole time, maybe that xWOBA is somewhere around, say, the 340 mark. So it's scaled to WOBA. So if 330 is the average OBP, anything plus 330 is really good. And the Cubs made a massive jump from bottom 5 in the league all the way up to the 7th. And I think that's a testament to bringing in Justin Stone and rewriting a lot of the programming, taking a very systematic approach, developing hitters. And I think that will eventually pay off at the major league level. It's one of those things where if you make that change, it does take some time to see the fruit at the major league level. I think that's maybe where fans get a little impatient in things. And this is happened to some extent on the pitching side as well, right? Breslow comes in. We're now kind of getting the wave. Like, maybe Caleb Kilian's debut didn't go as everyone expected. We're obviously hoping he bounces back. But you have Jordan Wicks. You have other guys. Wesneski's a great example. Acquired into the organization. Ben Brown's a guy they're going to adjust, and we're going to see up hopefully later this year. Like, it takes a little bit of time for these things to happen. And the biggest recalibration for me was on the offensive side and seeing that they, as an organization, are hitting the ball hard at the right angles. And that is just going to mean more peripheral talents like a guy like Jake Slaughter is not even on this list. Yeah. He's already up at AAA and mashing. Like, he was a tough one to get on. I just didn't necessarily think there was a positional fit, but he's a testament to that offensive growth where he's a relevant player in the organization and he's not even on the top 30 list.
Yeah, I mean, he had a breakout 2022 season in AA, right? He was in AA last year, but I mean, and I get it too, like 26 years old, so he's a little bit more advanced. But I'm glad you mentioned the hitting end because I think this would be it's a great segue into it, but like every rankings you've had so far, Lance, of this has been Brennan Davis, number one. Mm-hmm. PCA, Pete Crow-Armstrong is number one now. I think everybody understands listening to this. I imagine almost every Cubs fan has heard of PCA, understands what he can do, what he can be down the line. But Brennan Davis is no longer one. He's not even two, but he's all the way down to 10 on your list. Can you explain just a little bit about Brennan's drop and then kind of where you see things for him going from here?
It's a great question. I think I've gotten asked that by other people who have already seen the list too. It's a tough one because I think for me, again, I'm heavily based on the batted ball data. When he came back after the surgery last year, everyone in the organization, I think, understood that he was not at 100%. They wanted for him to get back, get reps. The approach was still there. The walks were still there. He looked relatively good, but the batted ball data took a massive hit. And for me, that's slightly worrisome in terms of having him above guys that are hitting the ball really hard, like Alcantara. Like Owen Casey absolutely mashes. Alexander Canario down with a big injury, but he had some of the highest raw exit velocities in the system. And it was a recalibration for me, kind of hedging against the possibility that maybe he never really recovers, which I'd hate to see. He's a really, really good dude, works really hard. I think he's from our side of the media, like just a guy that you want to see succeed, especially at the major league level. So this rank is a bit of a hedge between potentially him not bouncing back. And it pained me to do it, especially seeing Jim Cal still have him 3 on his list. But I just am taking a little bit more of a cautious approach with that recovery. I really hope he gets off to a hot start. The biggest thing for me is looking kind of mid to late this season. How is his body holding up and what are the exit velocities looking like? Even if he starts a little bit slow in Iowa, I think I'm okay with that. I just really want to recalibrate at the end of the year, assuming that this offseason he was able to build back up strength. But it's just the slightest twinge of worry that it's not what we saw at the Futures game. And that, again, I'm bummed about it because I'm a huge Brennan Davis fan. It's just, you have to get a little bit harsh when ranking guys like this. And I guess I took a little bit of a negative angle on him. But for me, it's just a hedge between potentially the back injury being a long-term thing that always comes back and has some issues and him bouncing back. So I hope I'm wrong on this one, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all very valid because it was a very mysterious injury.
Yeah.
I remember you talked to him last year right as he was coming back, but just like, he was in pain, didn't know why, they didn't understand until basically they opened him up and figured it out, and even then, figured it out is kind of a loose term. So, I'm with you. I mean, I totally understand it, and I agree with you. I mean, he's a guy that, like, I've enjoyed covering the few times I've had to talk to him, and he just seems like a guy that would be perfect in Chicago. It seems like the fan base would love him. So I'm really curious to see where it goes.
And he's got that confidence about him, right?
Yeah,
that it's like he knows he can do it. It's all about getting those reps. So it's totally not out of the question, too, that while we are talking about this, it's not totally out of the question that he could go out there and start in Iowa and just start mashing like he was pre-injury, right?
And at the midseason update on this, I'll immediately move him back up. It's really off that batted ball data for me, and I think that reflects a lot of the injury side for sure.
So last year in your rankings, you have one pitcher in the top 7.
Yeah.
Jordan Wicks. This year, you've got 3 in the top 5. that a testament to just the depth of the pitching staff and the overhaul that's gone in and just how healthy the organization is?
Yeah, I think you see that more in the back half of the list. I think this top half of the list is more about the acquisitions they made and getting really good return for guys like David Robertson, who they had in a one-year deal, made a lot of logical sense to trade. Same with Scott Efros. Yeah. Again, bummer he went down with Tommy John surgery, but that was the exact trade they needed to make to get talent back into the organization. And that's why you see Wisniewski at 3 and Brown at 4 for me. I really like both those pitchers. Wisniewski's a little bit based off. He's an interesting one because we knew he had the slider all throughout the minor league level. When you're projecting starting pitchers, in my opinion, one of the first things you look at is kind of fastball performance and what that shape is. That, I think, is the biggest predictor of starting pitcher success. And in the minor leagues, when he was traded, his fastballs weren't great. He throws the cutter, sinker, four-seam. None of them were exceptional. It kind of worked more off the sinker and the cutter. The four-seam wasn't great. So I kind of hedged a little bit and was like, okay, maybe he's not a starting pitcher. But then you get him up to the major level, you see the execution on the big stage, and you see the location on the slider. For me, that's the biggest part of that slider. These sweepers generally are reliever weapons. He uses it as starting pitcher because he's able to locate it so well and because he's had, from talking to him, the same grip for 3 years. And I think that's allowed him to kind of spur projections and very clearly means there's a guy that everyone kind of missed on, so to speak. And I don't see much variance, year over year for him. I think he is what he is. I think he's like a number 3, maybe a high-end number 4 in the organization. I like that guy up there because I just think there's a lot of projectability to that profile. And Brown is a guy, maybe there's a little more upside to. He's a through-and-through starting pitcher for me. He's the opposite of Wisniewski, where he has really good quality fastball. So I'm very confident he is a starting pitcher and can maintain a starting pitcher. It's a matter of what the organization does with his breaking balls.
Wisniewski is a guy that Andy and I have talked about just even on the season preview podcast about, like, I think we're both high on him just from covering him and talking to him. He seems like he has that it factor,
absolutely.
That intangible. So, like, you talk a lot about data, but I'm curious, Lance, like, how do you maybe, when you're considering these rankings, think about the, like, it factor, that thing that you can't quite put your finger on, that, like, Wisniewski's brain seems like he is well suited to a big league career just in the little bit that I've gotten to know him. How do you factor that in? I
do. Sometimes I don't do it as overtly on the list because sometimes I don't like calling out certain things that guys have told me and stuff. The one with Brown that I actually factored in, I'll say the number 4 prospect Ben Brown was acquired David Robertson trade from the Phillies organization. He at Cubs convention told us that he's a guy who like tapes his mouth shut at night to force air through his nose for better breathing. And I was like, that seems really hilarious, and everyone laughed at it. But to me, I was like, that is the exact kind of guy that I want in an organization because like he's doing everything he can to like extract every bit of talent out of his profile. And those are the guys I think that have a better chance of hitting their higher percentile outcomes. Where if, he does that, like I imagine he's also a guy who's really inquisitive about other things mechanically. Or like, what can I fix mechanically? Like, I can't imagine he's just like, just tape my mouth shut and that's going to make me a big leaguer. Like that's a pattern of behavior that I think is really important. So that's the one that jumps out to me. That's like, I don't know if I put him over Wicks because of that, but I definitely thought about it in the Ben Brown rank.
I mean, better sleep is important to better performance on the field.
Yeah.
And one guy that I talked to that does something very similar is Marcus Stroman, where he's mentioned he's gone
surprised,
underwater with his mouth taped shut to focus on breathing through his nose and having that center when he's out there of breathing strictly through his nose and not being a mouth breather, as he calls it. There is something to it for sure.
I could learn from that. I'm a mouth breather.
I mean, I think I'm right there with you too. You talked a lot about Ben Brown, but do you see him potentially being kind of like Hayden Wisniewski this year, where he could come up in the rotation either later on in the year at some point and kind of cement himself as a major leaguer?
I think he can, for sure. I'm not exactly sure what the organization thinks about bringing guys up as relievers first. I know this has happened in the Brewers organization a lot, talking to some coaches in the Cubs organization, and talking about some guys on this list, it seemed like they probably have a slant to bring a guy up as a reliever. But I'm, again, going back to the fastball shape, how it works in the zone, his ability to command that pitch, he is a starting pitcher to me. I think it's very difficult. Like, you look at most of the dominant relievers in baseball, they're usually throwing some kind of a nasty secondary in some extent. Even if they have poor location, it doesn't really matter for the most part. Like, you look at Emmanuel Clase with like a really weird cutter, Edwin Diaz down for the year, but really nasty slider. His fastball's fine. He throws it hard. But I don't think Brown would be a reliever for long. I could see bringing him up in the Keegan Thompson-y role as like a multi-inning. And then when a spot opens in the rotation, you got to give him a shot. But they did bring up Kilian right away and put him into the rotation. So I guess it's a matter of like,
I think
if
that
an
was also
injury happens,
right.
right?
Like Kilian was out of necessity, where it's like so many injuries occurred that Kilian just has to start because you need a body to actually start that day.
Does the development line up with the spot open at the major league level? That's kind of like a weird equilibrium that's struck. Otherwise, maybe he just pushes the envelope. They have 5 starters. He comes up as a multi-inning reliever, and then next year he gets the spot. But the reason I have those 3 pitchers, 3, 4, 5, is because they are starting pitchers to me. I'd be shocked if they end up as relievers.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, the full rankings from Lance and analysis on MarqueeSportsNetwork.com. So 3, 4, 5, Hayden Wesneski's 3, Ben Brown's 4, Jordan Wicks is 5. But Brown, obviously, with big risers, 13 on the last year, shortly after the trade deadline, shortly after the Cubs acquired him, moved all the way up to 4. Daniel Palencia is another guy, a pitcher also, but like he made a huge jump from 18 on your last rankings all the way up to 9 now.
Yep.
Can you just talk a little bit about like that huge rise in him? What have you thought of him differently, or like can you maybe explain just that huge jump?
Sure. I think it goes back to what I was talking about with the fastballs, but specifically with him, I thought a lot about whether a guy can actually make it at the major league level with 2 pitches, and I think the answer generally is just no. But we've seen it with guys like Spencer Strider. We've seen it with guys like Hunter Green, where if you have an exceptional fastball and a really good secondary, they both have to be well above average. You can do it. And I've talked to like other pitchers about this, other coaches about this and stuff. And for the most part, most of those guys will turn into 3-pitch pitchers. But like Strider's starting to throw a changeup this year a little bit. They tweaked it. Hunter Green's still primarily a 2-pitch guy from what I understand. And they are good at the major league level with 2 pitches because both those pitches are so good. They don't even really need to command them, so to speak. You just have to put them around the zone. This is where like Hunter Green kind of got beat up last year, is because he kind of wasn't able to put it over the zone, and he was in a weird spurt where when he did put it over the zone, it got hammered. But I think Palencia's in the mold of those 2 pitchers. I don't think he has as good as both those guys were as prospects. Strider might have been even a little bit underlooked as a prospect, and now he's one of the best pitchers in baseball.
Yeah.
But I think Palencia is of the same mold, where it's a slider that especially can work versus left-handed hitters because it's not a big sweeper. It's kind of more of like, I don't want to say Drew Smiley, but it fades a little bit to some extent because it's more of just a pure football bullet, so to speak. But he's a guy that I personally view as a 2-pitch starting pitcher, even with this kind of curveball he's throwing that I think is just more of a strike-stealing pitch that's pure early in the count. It's not really a put-away offering. Does he go to a changeup? Does he go to something else? Sure. Maybe the organization really wants him to have 3 or 4 pitches, but again, this is probably the last guy here that I'm very confident is a starting pitcher. I think Horton's a starting pitcher too, but I really like Palencia projecting him as a starting pitcher, and I also wanted to be aggressive on him because of everything I've seen in the data from how hard he throws. He sustains it. The shape's great. Throws a really good slider. Like, it's hard for me to have that guy outside the top 10.
And he's also a guy that has that, you know, we talked about that it factor, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
He also has it. I mean, he signed really, really late with the Oakland A's. He wasn't one of those guys that signed at 16 and has been in the system for a while. He signed at, I believe, at 20 years old and was late into the organization. And
you always get overlooked that way.
He's kind of young in the sense of he's not spent a lot of time in affiliated ball. That is also could be a help for him too, right?
I 100% agree for sure. I think those guys get overlooked so much that they do end up in trades, like the Andrew Chafin trade that we got Daniel Palencia as an organization from. That's how you get those guys, right? No one's really on them. No lists are really on them publicly, but you see him, you like him, you think he could tweak a thing or two, and then boom, he becomes top 10 guy in the organization.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here. When we come back, we're going to hear more just about new guys added onto the list, some of the guys who fell maybe on Lance's prospect rankings, and also a few guys that we're going to see at Wrigley Field potentially later this season. So stay tuned.
You've got the jersey, the ball cap, the foam finger. Everyone can see you're a Chicago Cubs fan from a mile away. Ready to take your look to the next level? Upgrade your wallet with an exclusive Cubs debit card, which you can get when you open a Wintrust Cubs checking account. With no monthly fees, free ATMs nationwide, and a $300 bonus when you open your account. Start showing your Cubs pride with every purchase. Sign up at wintrust.com/Cubs. Only $100 required to open. No monthly minimum balance and no monthly maintenance fees. Member FDIC and equal housing lender.
All right, we're back here on the Cubs Weekly Podcast. Andy Martínez, Tony Andracki, and Lance Brozdowski, our player development analyst here at Marquee Sports Network. And again, we're going over Lance's top 30 Cubs prospect rankings. So, Lance, right before the break, we were talking about a lot of guys who were big risers on the list. Ben Brown, Daniel Palencia, Christian Hernandez, and DJ Hers were guys that both dropped equally 6 spots. And you talked about, like, Cade Horton, Palencia is kind of the line of demarcation where you see as starting pitchers. Does that mean you kind of don't think DJ Hers is a potential future starting pitcher? And like where I guess where did your thoughts on him and Christian Hernandez change from last year?
Yeah, I'd say that they both dropped more so just me becoming more confident in guys above them rather than them having some skill decrease. With Hernandez, I think I've always been the cautious man on him because I think that the trajectory on a lot of these really young international prospects that get really high signing bonuses is you get like the roller coaster of a lot of hype. Yeah. And the expectations are like, this guy's going to become Ronald Acuna.
I mean, and Alex Rodriguez and Chris Bryant were throwing out both for him. Yeah,
exactly. And it's then you realize that like only Ronald Acuna is Acuna, and you're like, you drop down, and then it swings back up. There's a prospect in the Yankee organization, Jason Dominguez, who I think we'll see at the major league level, who went through this exact same trajectory. Where everyone,
the Martian because he was so good.
Everyone was like, it's Aaron Donald, the end for the Rams with a baseball bat. And then like he kind of stumbled a little early, everything went down, and now he's like going to end up probably being a good major league player. And that trajectory for me, I just wanted to stay flat on it. So I've always had him between, I think, like 8 and 13-ish. Like, I think he's good. I think he's really toolsy. There are things that need to change in his profile, and the organization, I think, is aware of this. I think they've made some conscious efforts to reorient his swing a bit. He's a guy that is a weird blend where you see like a really high K rate, but he wasn't really chasing a lot. So they were kind of pounding him in the zone. He was missing pitches in the zone, which is a bit like a Chris Morel problem to some extent, where he doesn't make a lot of contact in the zone. And that's, again, something I imagine that Morel's working at down in AAA. But with Hernandez, I see a bit of the same problem where, like, I want to see that corrected and then him to just mature physically.
Sure.
I think he can stay at shortstop, and he hits the ball really hard for his age as well, which I like. But I do think there are some swing and miss things there that are interesting to me. And I think I mentioned in the write-up of the list that, like, there's a few guys where I think after a month of this season, I'm the most interested in looking at what their performance is, like their average OBP homers, but also some of the underlying data. Hernandez is way up there because no longer do we have short season ball where he would normally probably go for a bit to start this year. He's going right to Myrtle Beach, and he's facing, like, Cade Horton's also going to Myrtle Beach. Cade Horton is a college reliever, or excuse me, college starting pitcher who pitched in the College World Series facing Christian Hernandez. Like, you're going to get, like, much better stuff than he's ever seen, and particularly guys who can locate that stuff. So the early part of this is going to be huge for us to just understand how he is and how he fares at Class A, and that is going to have a massive implication on his ranking from my perspective. So again, I'm hedging against that. I'm keeping him where it is. I'm expecting him to kind of struggle at the gate in Myrtle, and I'm going to keep him where he is. Like, I still think he's like a top 15 prospect in this org, and until he kind of proves that he's matured and gotten past some of the contact problems, that's kind of the only way I see him jumping up. DJ Herz, yeah, I think I view him as more as a reliever. He's a bit of a multi-inning guy. He's had some command problems. I'm a little torn too. He's had like a really crossfire delivery. So if you think of guys who like land very linearly, like perfectly in line with their back foot, he is a lefty who lands like way crossfire. He's a little bit like Jake Arrieta in that respect. That is something that I've heard other organizations talk about as not particularly indicative of starting pitchers. You don't see a lot of starting pitchers who are kind of crossfire, particularly because it's one of those strings that maybe puts a little more stress on your body because you're not going, like, think about stepping to your left and then trying to throw to your right. Mm-hmm. It's like guys who are very linear to the plate often is the best way to just stay healthy to some extent. It might be slightly incorrect in terms of how I'm phrasing it, but
also hard to just repeat that motion too, just for mechanics. If it's something that's more, I don't know, unconventional like that, it's just hard to duplicate.
And it creates a lot of doing it like 85 times a day, or 85 times a day, not including like warm-ups or anything like that, every fifth day, that can create some bad habits or some injury.
It's true, and I think it just maybe leans him more towards the reliever side for me. There's still a chance he ends up as a starting pitcher. Maybe they correct it and he's not as crossfire, and it works just as well, and then he's a starting pitcher, and then in which case he'd come up on the list. But for now, I have him 15-ish, and it's just becoming more confident in guys ahead of him. Another
guy that took another big drop, Caleb Kilian. How much of it was an injury that he had last year that kind of went undiagnosed, or not? I don't want to say undiagnosed, but wasn't too aware that was causing the mechanical issues. And is that someone that you could see either rise or kind of move in the rankings and maybe explain that explains the fall this year?
Yeah, the injury thing was real. I talked to him in spring training, and he's talked to other people as well about how he kind of changed some things mechanically, just in how he moves and everything. I'm still not totally convinced that the raw underlying stuff with Caleb Kilian is good enough, which might be crazy for someone throwing 96, 98. But again, like looking at the underlying data of how those pitches move, I think he's honestly better served as just being like a cutter slider reliever and seeing if he could jump up to 98-ish, averaging. the command that he showed and the ability to get the ball in the zone, I think, is making everyone believe he's a starting pitcher. But unless there's some shape change there where you're able to make the 96 and 98 play better in the zone, I kind of don't really view him as a starting pitcher anymore, which might be crazy. And I know the organization disagrees with me on this. I've talked to a couple people about it. Again, I'm taking a stand on him. I don't think he's not valuable. I just think the value has changed, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Like, I want to see him throw cutter slider at the major league level and just rip it and see if he can average like 98, 99. And that would play. I don't want to comp him to like in Emmanuel Clase, who I mentioned earlier, who's like a big cutter guy in the Guardians organization. He's a great closer for them. But like, that is kind of, I think, the trajectory Clase took, where he was like a starting pitcher, couldn't really command the ball, nothing was great, and then all of a sudden it was like, here's this cutter, just throw it 70% of the time. Caleb Kilian's cutter's great. I don't think any of his fastballs are amazing, you know? And that kind of limits where I see him long term. So I think I'm a bit of an outlier on him. I know, and again, I'll reiterate that everyone in the organization I believe he's a starting pitcher, and I think they're treating him as a starting pitcher. I just think the best value for him is to be some kind of leverage reliever.
Yeah, you have Kilian at 23, but even as we're talking about guys who have made the drop, I'm curious about a few guys who are new to this list.
Yeah.
So I know we expanded to top 30, but there's 5 new guys.
Yep.
Cam Sanders is the highest at number 22. Porter Hodge, you already mentioned, great name.
Yes.
25. Jefferson Rojas, 26. Kevin Made, 29. Luis Devers, 30. What about those guys stood out to, one, add in the list? Obviously, we're expanding by 5, but also specifically Sanders, too. He would have been in the top 25 even if you had done it. What stood out to those guys? Because Sanders was a guy the Cubs didn't even protect in the Rule 5 this winter, but looked awesome in spring.
I know. He's always had some command problems. That is the thing for him to correct. But again, the command floor to become a reliever I don't think as high as many people realize. I love Cam Sanders because the fastball's good. He throws a nasty kind of changeup that acts like a splitter because of how much spin he's able to kill on the pitch. And then he also has a really good slider. It's rare to me that you see a pitcher like him have 3 pitches of this quality. And at the end of last year, you start to see, as they moved into more of a reliever role, even kind of multi-inning, that he corrected the ability to get the ball in the zone a bit. So that, for me, is giving me a little bit of confidence that he comes into this year and is just a 3-pitch monster and can work in kind of leverage spots and maybe give them a little more length if they need it. But I don't know. I don't view him as that. I think he's like a legitimately good reliever with 3 pitches, which I don't think you really see. But I think also that ability to turn over the splitter, the change, I think it's actually a changeup, but it moves like a splitter, so I always thought it was a splitter. But that is really important, I think, especially with the shift band, to be able to neutralize left-handed hitters and create swing and miss as a righty. Like, this bullpen right now doesn't have a lefty. Like, at the major league level, Mark Leiter Jr.'s splitter works as if he is basically your lefty, so to speak. Sure. But I think, like, splitters as a whole, as we saw in the World Baseball Classic, are a pitch that everyone's going to start maybe tinkering with more. It's one that is really dependent on finger length and also the ability to spread your fingers, which is really weird. It's a really variable pitch.
So you're asking prospects?
I am. I'm asking them to see like if they could wedge the ball in there and keep it.
And measuring their fingers.
And I'm like, I have my timer right there. But no, those are 2 things that I understand as being very indicative of where you could throw a splitter. But again, Sanders doesn't even do that. He just creates so much depth that it can work in that way. I think getting lefties out as a right-handed pitcher is really important, especially late in games, especially without a shift. And it's not even putting the ball in play, like not with a cutter. Like, I want swing and miss from a righty to a lefty, and that's really much only done through a splitter or changeup. And this slider's nasty too. I'm betting that he finds enough command, gets up to enough of a floor of command that it's 3+ pitches as a reliever. So I'm a little more aggressive than the industry on him. He's also a guy that I'd say I brought in some anecdotal stuff. I think he's really, really sharp. He's also a really good guy too. Like, he's really cerebral around how he pitches, and he really understands everything he's doing. So I've really enjoyed talking to him. So maybe there's a little bit of personal bias there in bringing him up to 22. But I think he's good. I think we'll see him at Wrigley this year.
Yeah.
And there was a great point that was made up about the value of having a righty like him, and going back to Mark Leiter Jr. But in the sense that most teams don't like, if you have a lefty, the conventional wisdom is if you bring in a lefty to face a lefty, the opposing manager will be like, all right, I'm going to pinch it for my, unless it's like Shohei Ohtani or Yordan Alvarez, someone great like that, you're going to pinch it your righty for him.
Yep.
When you're not necessarily going to do that if you bring in Mark Leiter Jr. or Cam Sanders or someone who can neutralize lefties and righties with these kind of pitches. So there's value in having a guy that can do that, especially in the reliever role, like Cam Sanders can do.
I agree. You're picking a poison because I think both pitches are really good. So it's like, you want the splitter, you want the slider. Like, it's your call. Like, just keep the lefty in, I guess. And like, maybe you bet that he can't hit the splitter in the zone. But I think he's a good pitcher. I really like him.
So comparing this comparing the overall 30 prospects, top 30 prospects to a year ago, just how does the system as a whole compare in those 12 months since last year, at the beginning of last year?
Yeah, again, acquisitions are big here at the top of the list for sure, inside the top 10. It's also just gotten deeper. There's just more names that you have to consider because I think, as I talked about, the offensive production and what Justin Stone has done. There's a lot of pitchers too. Like, again, number 30 on this list is Luis Devers, who won minor league pitcher of the year, and I barely even had him on the list. I had him off the list. I had Nazir Moulay on, who's a two-way guy that's really fun, but he went down with Tommy John, so I decided to bring Devers on. And like, he's 30 on the list, and he won minor league pitcher of the year.
Right.
And he also looks bigger this year. So if the velocity ticks up for him, he's a guy that I think could jump up probably maybe near a Porter Hodge. There's just a lot of deeper guys in the system that have like a pitch or two that you're like, I have to consider now what they do to him going forward and whether it's a starter or reliever. Like, if Porter Hodge finds some command, he looked great when I saw him pitch in some live ABs down in spring training. He's a sweeper guy, so I think that pitch is more attuned to being a reliever weapon, but I also like that he has it this early in his career and he throws it hard. Like, he's 83 to 85 on it, which is a little harder than the average guy. So, like, I think he could end up being maybe like a Graham Ashcraft-y pitcher, like a Reds starting pitcher who's kind of popped last year, this year. Like, cutter, a little bit of sinker, a little bit of slider, and like can be a starting pitcher with that mix. It's just a matter of command. Like, Ashcraft got to the level of command where he's putting everything in the zone. I think Hodge is still on the fringes of that. But there's so many guys like this where there's a pitch or two that you're like, yeah, I could see this turning into some kind of starter. And then if you have that thought in your mind, you have to put him up into like the 15, 16s. And it's all a balancing act of that, because the value of a starting pitcher is obviously much higher than that of a reliever, especially on a list like this. And on the offensive side, just like Ballesteros is a guy who popped last year, hits the ball crazy hard, could maybe stay behind catcher, and has some ability to maybe clean up the body a little bit to be even more of a strong prospect in the org. And if they view him as a catcher, the offensive floor is much lower. He could end up being a guy that, like, there's a Pirates prospect, Andy Rodriguez, who's going to come up this year, who's really good. And he's a great defender, but he's also a really good hitter. I think Ballesteros could be, like, in a dream scenario, a version of Andy Rodriguez, where he's maybe not as good of a defender, but has more offensive power. And, you know, that's going to be really hard to not have that guy catching 70 to 80 games a year and then DHing in situations where, you know, you have a righty that you think he could hit. So I really like Ballesteros. So there's just a lot of guys in the back half of the list that I'm like, yeah, like, I'm excited to see their trajectory this year because I think they're good.
What, you know, and guys on the list, off the list, but which guys do you think will have the biggest impact at Wrigley Field this season? Let's exclude Hayden Wesneski from this list just because he's already on the big league roster. But, like, who are some of the guys that you think Cubs fans should be on the lookout for and, you know, could possibly see making impacts at Wrigley this year?
Yeah, Cam Sanders is the one that I'm going to call off, just because I think people don't really know who he is yet, but I think he'll be up this year. Jeremiah Estrada, too, I still have at 27. That's a really, really strong fastball with a slider as well. He's always been a reliever. I know he's talking about fastballs predicting success in major leaguers, or major league starting pitchers specifically, but I think Jeremiah Estrada comes up at some point and gets some kind of leverage innings here, especially if they end up trading off of Boxberg or Fulmer as the deadline approaches, especially on one-year contracts. Or was one of those was 2 year, weren't they? I might have mixed that up, but maybe both 1 year.
I think they both are 1 year.
Both 1 year? Yeah. Right, so they're both 1 year. So again, probability there may be trade at the deadline is high. So Estrada and Sanders are the ones I'd look out for. Ryan Jensen, too, is another one. We're talking about command. Jensen, unfortunately, probably has the worst command in the system on the top 30. But his stuff is astronomical. Like, it's raw stuff. He has the best raw stuff in this entire top 30.
And he's on the 40-man.
And he's on the 40-man. Yeah. It's just a matter of, like, it's a smaller body, really, really explosive delivery that I think it's always had problems controlling. And he throws multiple pitches, too. I'm not exactly sure if there's a push and pull between, like, reducing the repertoire, but the stuff, which is just a combination of, like, release height, velocity, and how a pitch moves, is like, it breaks systems based on when you plug it in and look at it. He's exceptional, but it's just a matter of trying to get him in the zone. So that is a rank that maybe is a little bit too aggressive, but I love his stuff so much. And this, again, I'm so influenced by the data. For the most part, I had to put him inside the top 25.
So who are some of the prospects that just missed the list that come midseason could be on the list? Hayden Wesneski will probably be off the top 30 list at that point since he will have graduated. So who are some of those names that just missed?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think back to who I had 30. Riley Thompson is one. Okay. Riley Thompson was almost on the list. He's a bit of like an over-the-top guy. He kind of reminds me a little bit of like James Karinchak from the Guardians, who's a reliever. But Riley's a little bit more of a starter. It's really over the top, so the curveball plays off the fastball well, but he also has the ability to throw a changeup. I think he's a starting pitcher, but he's ran into so many injury problems that I'm not exactly sure what the profile is. And I'm not exactly sure if any of those individual pitches is as good as some of the guys in that back half of this list, like Estrada's fastball, Devers changeup, Hodges sweeper. Like, I don't think he's in that window, but if he shows up at AA and jumps to AAA by the end of the year and looks as good as he did in the live ABs I saw him in, then I'm pretty confident he'll jump up. But for now, I'm keeping him off at a little bit of hesitation for that.
It's kind of funny that we've gotten this far in the prospect list, and we haven't even really talked Matt Mervis, like the breakout prospect of last year. And I realized as I was looking at the rundown too that like I didn't even think about him because it seems pretty, in some ways, almost obvious, right? Like he started the year in AAA. There's a potential path for playing time, but Lance, I'm curious from your mind, like what he's ranked 8 on your list. What do you see as 2023 holding for Mervis? Like, when could he be up in Wrigley Field? Like that, just all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
I really like Mervis. I struggled to get him higher than 8th because of the defensive position. He feels like a guy that in this this through 3 games of the major league season that the team needs, I think, to some extent. Like he went back down to AAA, first couple games just absolutely mashed. I get he didn't really have the strongest spring, but that guy has the makeup, as we're talking about like Ben Browns of the world and stuff who have that. He's got the it, and I'm convinced that he's a guy that's going to come up later this year and hit immediately. And then all of a sudden the team has more power than maybe we were projecting it, especially minus Suzuki. If you add Suzuki back to this lineup, you add a guy like Matt Mervis into the lineup, like I think you could stumble into guys who are able to drive in the Swansons and Horners of the world that obviously have the proficiency to get on base, but maybe don't possess as high of slug as most organizations would like for them to become like exceptional offensive players. I really like Mervis. I understand some people have him outside their top 10 because of the defensive position. I'm more convinced that the bat is a major league bat. We'll see if I'm wrong. I know there's some other people that don't even have him like top 15 in the system, and barely. I don't even think of him at top 100. But there's a little bit of an if factor there where I think he sees that. I think he's one of those guys that maybe like knows that and like it jumps his performance up a little because
he's got that edge.
I think he's got a little bit of an edge. So when he comes up, I'll say late May. It might be a little earlier than other people are projecting, but I think at some point he's just forcing their hand. You can't keep him in AAA for another half season if he continues doing what he did last year, in my opinion. You got to bring him up and see what he is.
Another guy that you and I have talked about in the past plenty of times, number 2 on this list, Kevin Alcantara.
Yeah,
love
this guy.
What do you see in him this year? And I think, you and I have spoken about it. I think this is a guy that by the end of the year, everyone in baseball will know him as a prospect.
Absolutely, yeah. I think he was a little overmatched in spring, and I think that's also okay. Like, I get he's a 40-man guy, so like maybe they want to accelerate the timeline a little bit, but he's still relatively young. Like he was in the Yankees organization for a really long time, and then he got traded like this. I think he was signed in 2017, if that's off the top of my head, that's
right,
correct.
Yeah.
It's just taken him a lot to grow into power in his body and his speed, and it's a really electric combination. Like the spring training talent that he saw was strong. Like it's probably AA to AAA level for the most part, and he's starting at high A. Like he hadn't played above A ball, so like I get that like maybe everyone wanted him to hit 5 home runs in spring, but like it's totally fine if he hits like 200. Like all the tools were still there. He's still got like a gorgeous swing. He's really, really explosive. His speed is unbelievable. I think he's a good corner outfielder. I think that he just goes to South Bend and does what he did in Myrtle, and he's hitting the ball harder. He's bigger. Like I wouldn't be shocked if he's a guy who goes South Bend to Tennessee this year, finishes in Tennessee. It's just a matter of kind of dealing with some of the growing pains of him having a really long swing. Not long swing, long levers in his swing. I wouldn't say his swing is long, but he's going to get chewed up and in by pitchers, and it's a matter of like trying to make some kind of adjustment to either lay off those pitches or just accept that you're never going to be able to cover that part of the zone because of how long he is. I really like him. I think I considered him above PCA a little bit because of the offensive upside. But for the most part, I think the floor on PCA is just too high. But these are the clear 1-2 in the system. And when I was talking at the beginning of this podcast about the separation between, say, 3 and 13 not being that big, PCA and Alcantara to me are on another tier, and then you hit everyone else on the list. These are the keystone prospects, so to speak.
I want to kind of put you on the spot a bit here, too. We talked about Wisniewski, but Javier Asada, not a part of this list. He was impressive last season when he came up, super impressive at the WBC. How did you view Assad, and what did you think about it?
He was a just missed. Yeah.
He was, okay.
Yeah, he's a just miss. It's tough for me because I don't think he's like a leverage reliever based on the pure stuff, although he did kind of get up to 97, 98 for 2 weeks ago, which was really impressive. I was torn on him on the role and if it's truly like a starting pitcher. The other thing, too, is you get into here of like, some of the back half of the top 30 guys, leverage relievers. Like I think Zach Lee and Jeremiah Estrada at 27, 28 are kind of leverage relievers. And then like a number 5 starter that only pitches a couple hundred innings at the major league level and then kind of phases out of baseball. Like I don't think that's more valuable than a leverage reliever or a guy who even pitches the 8th for an extended period of time. I'm caught up on the role for Assad. I don't know if it's a starting pitcher. It's kind of like, it's actually a little bit like Hayden Wesneski, oddly enough, where it's like multiple fastballs, like forcing cut sink. And I don't necessarily know if there's a ton of upside in that, but the upside clearly I'm tapped into is the velocity side of things. Right. So I don't know. Maybe I think there's a real case he could be 25 on this list right behind a Hodge. I think Hodge is a little bit more upside than Javier Assad will have. But yeah, I guess that was just a personal thing of just kind of maybe seeing it already at the major league level, not thinking anything was like blow your brains out in terms of exceptional in the pitch shape side. But I think there's totally a case for him to be like 25, 6, 7 here. And I could eat crow on that if he ends up being a great pitcher for the Cubs for sure.
We touched on those bottom half of the list. You mentioned someone like Moises Ballesteros, Porter Hodge. Who do you think is poised to make the biggest jump this year from that maybe that bottom half of the list?
It's a good question. I think Ballesteros can really jump up. I think the bat is good enough, and I guess we'll get better reports on how he is as an actual catcher. But if he's a catcher if he's a good catcher and he's hitting, I think he just becomes Miguel Amaya to some extent, and he's younger, and not the injury history that Amaya has. I still have Amaya 16 on this list because he hits the ball really hard. I'm not totally convinced he's a catcher, but it seems like he is catching again, and I think we're trying to recalibrate how good of a defensive catcher he is. So I think Ballesteros could easily jump up to be 15-ish. Ed Howard's another one too. Ed Howard, right before he went down with injury, was hitting the ball harder than like most of the guys in the system, and that really jumped out to me in the data. It's just it was all on the ground. He had like a 60% ground ball rate. That's a guy that I think could very clearly be like a top 8 prospect if he just comes back healthy and continues hitting the ball hard, and then starts to maybe slightly lift it more. Like that's a shortstop glove. Like he's a guy that the hedge at 14 for me on that rank is again the injury side, but I think people would be stunned to see how hard he's hitting the ball right before he went down with the injury at South Bend. He was a guy that if he didn't go down with that injury, I think would have been at Tennessee by the end of the year and been hitting relatively well. It's just all about him correcting where he's hitting the ball. It's easier to hit hard ground balls if he can lift a little bit, even if he drops how hard he's hitting it. It's a real good bat. That was one of the ones looking at the data that I was like, wow, I didn't realize he was hitting the ball that hard and looked that good before he went down to injury, which makes the injury just even harder to swallow.
Yeah.
But I really like Ed Howard. I think he's a little bit slept on right now, for sure.
Yeah, he's had a tough go of it, right? Like his senior season getting wiped out with COVID, but Chicago kid, first-round pick in 2020. So certainly a guy that I know a lot of people around here would like to see you proven correctly with that he jumps up the list. But Lance, thanks so much for stopping by. Like, we really appreciate all the insight, the ability just to talk more about this. And again, go to MarqueeSportsNetwork.com for the full rundown, all the analysis from Lance for the top 30 prospects, why everybody's there. The full write-up is on there now. So thanks again for tuning in. That'll do it for this week's edition of the Cubs Weekly Podcast presented by Wintrust. Don't forget to download and subscribe to the pod on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and check us out in video form on the Marquee Sports Network app and YouTube. For Andy and Lance, I'm Tony. Thanks for tuning in.